So here I'm going to talk about graphics and text and how to incorporate them into a macroeconomic report. This is kind of my rules, but they're things that are universally accepted. But then again, your professor, your boss, or an academic journal might want their own way. But this is what works for me, and this is kind of what I like and what I use and what I kind of expect. So I'm talking about how to incorporate graphic principles and then some text considerations into writing an economics report. All right, so to start out with graphics, I talk about efficiency, how to use space best, choosing an appropriate graph, some graphs to avoid. My least favorite is the pie chart, and then use of color. That's actually how to use black and white rather than color. Okay, so efficiency in this sense is how to get the most information per unit of space. You're maximizing information or minimizing space, and that's kind of the goal. I'm going to compare this table that I made with some random numbers versus the pie chart. Now these could be scaled to different sizes, but this has the most information. It's got exact numbers. The percentages can be compared easily. Here, if you want to know that this is 55.61%, you can't. You know it's a little more than half, but your brain has to do a lot more work. And you could add numbers, but then you're not really adding any information that the table couldn't do. Pie charts visually distort angles and sizes, and so it's very difficult for the human eye to really get what's going on. The table actually has more information per unit of space. All right, and that gets to the idea of what's the appropriate graph. You have a goal for your data, right? If you want to show percent of the total, the pie chart does show that, but you might not want that. If you had a table of majors and non-majors, you might have them take up 100%. You would want to use something that had that. And if you pick the wrong thing, then you're actually not getting at the goal of your data. Some people use a line graph when they should use a table, but sometimes people use a table when a line graph should do. So people have, instead of a time series line, they'll have a table with every year's value. Right, and so you have to really know what you want out of your data, and you have to choose. And it's an art and a science, but there is science to it in the sense of how you're using visual principles and how you're using this principle of efficiency to convey that information. Sometimes a different graph style will do, and sometimes words will do. If you say 57% are X, then that actually gets the point across without using any table at all. I suggest looking at other people's work, looking at papers, journals, see what people do, in the field or professionally. Okay, I mentioned avoiding the pie chart, but 3D graphs are bad. One reason is that there's some visual tricks. So if something is twice as much as something else, they'll actually make it twice as big in one dimension and twice as big in the other dimension. So in fact, that's 2 times 2. And so instead of being twice as big, it's 4 times as big. And so if you want to say something about relative size, people actually can make the second graph look way bigger. And that tells the reader that something is even bigger than it really is. And that's kind of a visual trick. People use pictures and infographics. I don't like using like stacks of dollar bills instead of just a bar chart. Sometimes people get really cute. In economics, you should avoid that. Really get the point across. Okay, and so make sure you're not getting at this idea of conveying the information that's actually incorrect. If something's 50% bigger and you're making something 300% bigger, you're actually tricking someone whose eyes are telling them more than their brain is telling them. All right. Here I took my information. I've got 4 different ways of doing it. This bar graph kind of misses the point. It does not convey things as 100% of the total. So your brain actually has to do more work. You have to add up these slices in your head and then divide or split them up. So this is actually inefficient. It's got a lot of white space, and white space is one of those things that are, no information per unit of space. So this kind of breaks 2 rules, at least. It doesn't show the goal of breaking up to 100%, and it leaves too much space. A little bit better is this bar graph, which doesn't have the white space here, but it doesn't add up to 100%. This 100% stacked bar does, and it gets this idea. Now, I didn't do anything to label it at all, right? So you have to put the numbers on it or the X, Y, Z, but this gives the idea in the dimensions of basically it's one dimension, right? This is the percent of the total, and then the second 1%, right? It's an equal width, so it's honest in that sense, right? And you can eliminate the white space as well. So this does the best job of conveying the idea of proportion of the total without any inefficiencies, without any visual distortions, right? I threw the sliced donut on here. This is something that Excel does. Clearly there's white space in the middle. This has all the problems. These angles are not 90 degrees. All the problems of a pie chart. It's a little bit cuter, but again, once you have to add the numbers on just to get your point across, you have to think about why you just don't have those numbers in the first place. Right. Now, moving on to use of color, I make this point elsewhere, but I don't use color when I print because it costs money to print. I've got a black and white printer at home. If people say, look at the green line, I can't see it. If you are in an academic journal, they actually charge you for color prints. Anybody else might charge you. Ink is expensive, color ink is expensive, and you have to keep that in mind. Someone's going to pay for it, and it could be you. All right, so I use black and white or grayscale all the time, and with different thicknesses as well as dashes and dots to differentiate the lines. Okay, so you can have dark gray, black, light gray with different types of dashes. I do this mostly in R, but also Excel. And then, but one trick is that you have to avoid too many lines. If you see 20 countries with 20 lines, you're not going to be able to tell one from the other, no matter whether you use color or not. All right, now with images, you can clip, you can copy. I talk about that, taking things from Fred data or other images. You can use, actually Microsoft has, it's the snipping tool, or the snip and scan, I think it is now. You can actually select and clip and put it in your data. But one thing you should check is that when you clip it, it might be what's called a low resolution photo. All right? Now also when you clip, don't straight plagiarize, right? Sometimes people will take someone else's graph, unless it's sourced, unless it's something that you have the right to take. Taking someone else's work is not, it could be illegal, it could get you an F in class, but it's also ethically wrong. So when you copy, make sure you're copying something you're supposed to copy. But technically, if you do use the snipping tool or the snippet scan, make sure you know that what it's copying at a certain resolution, which is how fine the image is, right? High quality photos have many more dots per inch. Low quality photos are fuzzier, okay? And so it's measured in dots per inch or DPI. A lot of journals, books, other publications want at least 300 dots per inch. I do stuff in 600 dots per inch, but the internet sometimes does only 72. Windows, I checked a while back, it was 96, and so if you tried to print that, it would look fuzzy. One way you might see that is people take like a Facebook photo, which is really small and optimized for the web, and they blow it up, it's super fuzzy, okay? Now that's not good enough for professional context, right? So you might have to change your computer settings. In R, I show how to print things at high resolution, all right? That's just something, it's good enough for a web document, PDF, some of the stuff I use is fine in the default, but you might find it's not high enough quality for what you need. Okay, and then when you move on to text, you've got things like different fonts. Fonts are basically back in the day when they had metal, printing, the printing press. They would have a font is like a fountain. They would just have like a bunch of metal blocks with all the letters on it, and they were carved to be different, different styles. Okay, and so now you can choose anything you want in Word, but back then you actually had to physically go into the bucket, grab some metal, put it on, and then make your thing. Right, so basically, when now fonts, there's much more types, but we use sort of the terminology from long ago. All right, so a lot of times, and I'll show you this in Word, the default is Calibri, which no one uses. A lot of times Times New Roman is the common one, and if you do stuff in Times New Roman, 12 point. You actually have to choose that in Word, but it looks like a standard document like you've seen elsewhere, all right? But there's many, many more types that you can do, all right? I use Century Schoolbook. I like Courier New because it looks like a typewriter, but you can go, nobody wants Comic Sans, right? We know not to do that unless it's a child's birthday party, although there are some accessibility reasons why people do use it, but it does look, if you're going to do a professional report, don't do it in Comic Sans. But you could choose a lot of different things. If you can choose the paragraph style with line spacing and so forth, the paragraph settings allow you to do single space, double space, all those things. You might want to play around and do things for the document you need. Okay, but when you're doing something professional, you might want to change the margins, change the layout, and all that in Word. Okay. Now, serif fonts have this little tail at the bottom, and sans, or without serif, there's no little tail on the F, okay? So serif fonts are good for text, sans serif fonts are good for tables, okay? So if you're doing a table of data, Arial is a good default, but you want to make sure that it looks kind of round, and so generally your text in your document will have serif font, and your tables will be sans serif. Size differs by whatever you're working on. Students like the 15-point font if they have to fulfill a paper length requirement. Generally 10 or 12 point are good. Tables can be 8 or 6, but there's a minimum size. If you get too small, it's not readable, okay? So that depends on what you're using, but you can play around with that, okay? And then I prefer full justified papers. Some people like left justified, but again, it's all about what looks professional. And again, it depends on what you are working on. Okay, so besides that, you can choose different spacing between margins and between lines. But when you work with Word, the default settings are actually kind of bad, and so you have to go in and change things. And then you can go into layout settings where you can get margins and tables and things like that. Or I do the paragraph settings, and you can change the between lines and so forth. All right. But again, when you want something to look good, always ignore the defaults for two reasons. One, the defaults aren't that great, but two, people know the defaults, and it looks like you just went with the default settings, and that sends a signal. And that's really important for economics, because in economics you learn about asymmetric information and signaling. Basically, you're signaling that you know how to use software in a professional setting. Now, if you write a paper in economics, you should write it in LaTeX, right? And you learn to basically code your paper. And it's inefficient in the sense that a lot of journals want it in Word or PDF or whatever. There's really not a whole lot of efficiency to it, but you're signaling that you are professional in playing the game, so to speak. You're doing what needs to be done professionally. If you're working in Word, it sends a signal, that you can use Word. But if you use the defaults in Word, it's basically sending a signal that you don't have the sophistication or the knowledge to customize your paper, right? So part of this is the actual efficiency and productivity that we talk about in economics. But part of it is also the signaling that you know how to use software, and that sends, tells employers, tells people that you have the professional skills that they might be looking for. All right. So here we're talking about graphics. The principles are essentially how to, choose the right graph, and how to, use the principles of conveying information efficiently. And then we talked about the text and how you can play around to kind of use things like, choosing the right font size and so forth. And that'll help you make your economics, or really any paper, the most high quality, well done project that you can do.